and you let me know what you think. So I've got a handful of cartoons here about resumes. This one just was funny. My experience is being the guy on the left side of the desk here. So for 10 years in the director of hospital medicine at the U, and then the program director, I read a lot of resumes, thought about how people were going about trying to get a job. And then also as the program director, I assisted the section heads with reviewing CVs for annual reviews as part of sort of supporting them, because the division got so big. That was a really substantial task. So I thought about this for current faculty, for applying faculty, and then of course in my own CV, maintaining that and using it successfully for promotion. So you may be wondering, well, hey, I'm already employed here. Why should I maintain my CV? Like, why, what's in this for me? And I'm going to offer two sort of categories of benefit. One is around promotion, which is that the CV is this mandatory document for your annual review, and it communicates your eligibility for promotion. Obviously, there are other ways to do that in the meetings that you'll have with section head and division head. But it's really the permanent record of what you've accomplished that officially goes through the rest of the sequence with the department, the School of Medicine. And so it's really important to have it in great shape, but also having it in great shape means you can have a really excellent conversation with your division leader, section head, whoever, about what you've been accomplishing and what you aspire to do. Now, in the realm of applications for other roles, the CV may take a really different format, and I'll talk about that. But even if you already have a job, if you want to change the mix of duties you have, for example, to take on a new leadership role, they're usually needed if you're competing for an award, regional or national award. You have to have a special format to apply for a grant. And I'll talk a little bit about how you should manage your CV when you're invited to give a lecture. So here are the learning objectives, and they're broken into these two categories of what you need to know for promotion, what you need to know for applications. And around promotion, it's really about identifying what goes into your CV and formatting it to the UW requirements, and then knowing who looks at your CV annually in the promotion process and what they're looking for. On the application side, this is a little bit of a niche topic, but I want you to be able to just know what a bio-sketch is very briefly and how it's different from a CV. And then more important, improve your CV to put your best foot forward as an applicant for whatever you're seeking. So there are a few Dilberts littered through here, but the topic here is embellishing your CV. And the idea of somebody who doesn't work but puts a lot of stuff on their CV probably happens a lot in the business world. And what I want to help guide you through is the art of really taking full credit for the things you are achieving without falsifying things. So one of the most, this is going to seem, I think, kind of mundane, and this is again where some feedback would be helpful, but I will say that as somebody who's reviewed a lot of CVs for the annual review process, sometimes it strikes me that people don't know the proper format, and it gets in the way of that conversation progressing to other topics because the section head sometimes feels compelled to start tuning up the CV instead. And so knowing about the UW resume format and how to adhere to it is a pretty important step. None of these guidelines are particularly unusual to the University of Washington, but there is a document, and I'm sorry, with chat and multiple screens, I'll have to share it later, but I'll make sure you all get a copy of it. There are at least 16 categories. There's sort of a 17th other, and they need to be in the required order. But if a category doesn't apply to you, that's okay. Put none or NA. You still list it. And the other thing is things go oldest to newest, right? You're telling the story of your life, so it's going to be college, med school, residency, anything else that sort of happened in between. But when you deviate from some of these expectations, it throws off internal reviewers, and then they get fixated on the fact that your CV doesn't look right rather than your accomplishments. So you do want to stay sort of in tune with these requirements. These are the 16 or 17 areas. They go left to right, row 1, row 2, row 3. I'm not going to go through all of these. Like I said, I'll share the document that helps you to do this. And the ones that are underlined are the ones that I want to pull out, something where I frequently see junior faculty missing an opportunity to sell themselves, or just doing something weird and maybe needing to fix it. So this is what the document looks like. Again, my intent is not to go through it, but just sort of say it's digestible. It's a one-page item, and there's some rules about each of the areas. And I will also say, if you are a fan of the Pirates of the Caribbean, you will know about the Code of the Pirate Brethren. And you'll also know that it's not really a code. They're more like guidelines, really, right? So same here. There are some rules you don't want to break, and then there's some areas where you really can take liberties and work within the UW format to highlight how excellent you are. So here are my 6 quick tips on how to do that. The first is more sort of a don't do this. I frequently see CVs that mix up faculty and hospital positions. So this may seem really basic, but I'm just going to walk through it. Your faculty positions are your rank, your division, your department, and your school, and really nothing else. And in the chronological order that you held them. So I have a fictional example here. Imagine somebody who was a clinical instructor for 4 years in general medicine at the University of New Mexico. That would go first. And then they became a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Surgery at the UW. That goes second, right? It's about title, division, department, and school. That's all that goes here. The other stuff that tells people about the kind of work you do goes in what's called the hospital positions. And this is where you put things like, I'm an attending physician in an adult medicine clinic at Harborview. I'm, I work in the pre-op clinic at the Boise VA, or whatever it is that you do clinically. Now, as your career grows and you take on responsibilities that are non-clinical, it's totally okay to add subcategories under this. Say, okay, well, here's my clinical job, and here's my leadership job. Like, I don't even know if this job exists. It sounds really cool. So I thought I would say, like, imagine you're the director of virtual hospital programs, right? You're doing home care from VA Puget Sound, and that's your new title. Well, that could go under leadership. It might be that your clinical job is primary care doctor in GIMC, right? So separate those out. As you accumulate more roles, it may make sense to block them into clinical leadership and sometimes other like educational leadership roles. And I'm not monitoring the chat. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Alicia. Use words. Yeah. So just like for like hospital would be like clinics even that aren't associated with a hospital then, right?
Correct. Yeah. And this is where I'm not going to apologize for this this format, but I will say, on the whole, it looks old and tilted towards things that physician scientists need to share on their CV, and that's why things like hospital position is sort of outdated, right? But yes, that's exactly right. You read into that clinical positions, even though the form says hospital. Okay. Tip 2 kind of falls into that same category of sort of tipped towards physician scientist faculty, and you have to define this in ways that make sense for you if you're in a full-time clinical or clinician scholar pathway. So it says list your honors here, and it gives some examples of honors as if these were the only honors you could ever hold, right? So Beta Kappa, AOA, RCDA, which is Research Career Development Award, right, which is going to apply for anybody other than an NIH-funded investigator. So here's my tip. Don't worry about what it lists here. List any awards that you have won, and then explain them, because it's really hard for a reviewer to know, okay, is this a really prestigious award, or what does it mean? How often is it given? So sometimes I see or have seen people say, well, I got this resident teaching award. And I'll say, well, what does that mean? And like, oh yeah, well, I was selected, as the best teacher in the universe, right? And it's like, well, you gotta say that about yourself. So don't hesitate to put what is relevant in your domain of work and describe what it is, so that you get sort of recognized for how impressive it is. It's also okay early in your career. You probably may have none or very few awards. This is one of those areas where it's normal to put NA or to have very little. So don't feel like you're supposed to have pages and pages of awards. Okay, tip 3. This is more my personal sentiment than anything, but I think it'll tie back to the question of what you're doing with your CV with a sort of local audience in mind. What I often see junior faculty do is list every organization to which they belong. That's fine, but it's rarely interesting. It's usually not important to me that you pay dues and get the journal at SGIM, right? What really matters and what advances this concept of your regional and national reputation is something that demonstrates that you're giving back to the profession, right? That you're volunteering time to that society to do something for other physicians and patients indirectly. So, and the bar is low here for what I think is worthy to list. Are you a member of a special interest group, which might mean you show up a couple times a year? Fine. Are you an office holder, even at a regional or local level? Did you help to run a meeting? Did you judge posters or abstracts? Or for things like ACP or SHM, are you a fellow? Right? These are the kinds of things you want to list here to say, I'm not just I didn't just take my CME money and get into the organization. I'm actually doing something to give back. All right. Tip 4.
So Andrew, can I interrupt to ask a question about the last tip?
Yeah.
Some of that information might overlap with special, local, regional, or national responsibilities on the CV. Do you write them in both places, or what? Any thoughts about what?
No, probably wouldn't. Although if you do, I don't think nobody's going to be upset about it. I think the things that are really ongoing responsibilities, or like national level committees, those would go in the special national responsibilities section. If you're doing something like judging the abstracts for the regional SGIM meeting or something, I wouldn't put that as a special national or local responsibility. The local responsibilities are really intended to be within the UW. And so that's the perfect thing to go in the professional societies section, so that you get credit for it. Yeah, I mean, if you read 25 resident abstracts, it takes you a few hours, and you should get credit for that. That's doing far more for SGIM or ACP than a lot of people choose to do. And go ahead and broadcast that. Does that answer your question? And yeah, Addie says that would imply you have CME money. Yes, I apologize. Not everybody does, and I will still say that spending your own money, it's not necessarily something that I would use the CV to highlight, even though it's sort of it's frustrating, and the Boise VA would like to hire you.
Sorry, I'm just eating my lunch. Otherwise, I would comment. But thanks, everyone. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, tip 4. What do you do about non-degree, non-board training? Because this is not anywhere in the UW CME format. And what I would suggest to you is I think it's totally appropriate to create a heading under board certification for these sorts of things, but you want to be really judicious. I have seen CVs where people literally list every 1-hour CME course they took, as if they were trying to convince me they had just like learned a lot. So that's sort of overwhelming and irritating to a job, to a hiring individual. What you want to do is pick things that didn't get you board certified and didn't get you a degree that really set you apart, or in particular fulfill a procedural or clinical need. So I'll just sort of give you an example of what I have on mine. And it might be now that basically everybody's getting DEA waivers. Being a hospitalist who prescribes buprenorphine is no longer notable. That's totally fine. I might remove it. But the point is, I have a clinical credential that took a day worth of learning and then becomes applicable in clinical practice. And then these other things, Epic Physician Builder, that's like a lot of work. And somebody who looks at me as an informaticist will say, oh, okay, he actually knows how to modify the EHR in a really substantial and different way. But this is it. So for me, and there may be totally different and applicable things to you, and just create your own subheading so you get recognized for special skills that make you worthy of being hired.
Andrew, can I just ask a like very granular question? So that subheading you literally put under the board certification, like you have that, and then you list your board certifications, and then you just have an indented subheading that says other certifications. Okay. Yep.
That's where it makes the most sense for most people. It's sort of as a continuation of education. You've got your undergraduate, medical, graduate, board certification, and then what else makes you qualified for the role. And so things like certified professional in patient safety, if you have a lean Six Sigma black belt, unfortunately, I'm sort of limited in my thinking about this to my sort of informatics and quality and safety work, but those would be the kind of things you could put there that come to my mind. And it may be that if you are certified in POCUS, or you place IUDs and nobody in your clinic does, or I don't know, some other medical procedure that's unique, that's where that should go. Teaching scholars, yeah, totally. That's perfect, Addie. Yeah, that's exactly where that should go. That really sets you apart. It's right. You don't have a degree, you don't have a master's, but you know way more than somebody who hasn't gone through teaching scholars. Yes, certificate program would go there. Those are great examples. So. Question about teaching responsibilities. This is tip 5. And I'm just telling you what the UW guidance here is. List specific courses, responsibility, percentage of responsibility, indicate role of teaching committees, recent CME, that is that you have given, not received. List trainees during the last 5 years. The problem with all this is it reads like the duties of a non-clinical medical faculty who's teaching like nursing 506 and physiology 402 and I don't know what else, or a lab director who has 8 postdocs and they're going to be judged by did they all get NIH grants after they left your lab. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is take lots of liberties with this. This wasn't written for GIM, and I encourage you to, because teaching is so important for career advancement, to organize as you like. And at the start of your career, just list everything you're doing. And as it starts to accumulate, every lecture, every small group session you do, every volunteer role, you're helping somebody else out with their paracentesis workshop, you're giving noon conference in clinic, it's not your material, but you're there sharing it anyway, count it all. And as it piles up, put it into categories. So UME, GME, CME, are you a course director of something? Are you mentoring people? And when I say bedside, and Addie, yeah, sorry, I'll get to that in just a sec. The bedside teaching, in this case, it doesn't make sense to list everything you do like hour by hour. Think more of like, I attend on the UWMC wards 4 months out of the year, and I am in Roosevelt Clinic you know, 5 half days for 10 months out of the year or something like that. That's, you summarize your teaching activities at the bedside with clinical learners in that section. Question about talks given. If it's an invited lecture, and by invited, I mean you were going somewhere else to do it, not like you're like Shom invited me to do this lecture, but it's not an invited lecture, right? It's a local FDP talk. It would go in this section. If the department chair of Emory calls me up and says, you really got to give that faculty development talk at Emory, you know, come to Grady next week, then that's an invited talk and it goes in that separate section. All right, and then in a distant phase of your career, as your portfolio grows, consider whether a reader can digest, oh, and local grand rounds. Local grand rounds is an invited talk, right? So that's a great point. And it is, but it is a talk, so I probably was a little too fast in responding. Talk series that are intended to draw from outside the institution in most cases. When you get invited at your own institution to give grand rounds, that is a national talk, even though it is presented locally. It's because the sort of pool of, you know, who's invited is a national pool. So as your portfolio grows, consider whether you need to condense it. And I've seen, actually Shom does this, and I've seen his CV in the past, and I've taken to this as well. And what you could do is when you get to the point where you've given the same lecture 10, 20 times, rather than continue to list every instance of it, which is fine when you're getting started out, say, you know what, I'm really good at talking about TPN. This is a, you know, you create a table, say talks frequently given, you know, hypertension, coronary artery disease, you know, given every year for 10 years in resident noon conference or whatever. And so then somebody, rather than looking at a dizzying array of lectures that you've given over 10 or 20 years, they can start saying, okay, I get what this person is teaching about and where their expertise lies. And yeah, they've taught a lot, and I can sort of see that. I don't need like every instance anymore. So the point here is take lots of credit. And then as you discover, it's just your CV is going pages and pages, which will happen to many people who teach on a regular basis, then condense it. But don't wait for that to happen. Take the credit early in your career. All right, tip 6 is about bibliography. Here there really is a defined format. You need to stick to it, but use it to highlight your hard work. And so this may not apply to everybody because I know you're not necessarily all working to write papers or across the division, but let me sort of share the things that are that can be helpful. The first is that if you have more than 5 papers to highlight, the department says pick the top 5, the ones you regard as the most important, and put a double asterisk in front of them. Second, bold your name, because people who are scanning these CVs to get a sense of how productive you are will want to know pretty quickly, are you frequently a last or first author, where you're leading teams or leading the project, or are you usually a middle author? And there's no shame in being a middle author, but if you have first or last author publications, they'll notice that right away by bolding your name. List the PubMed ID. This is a sign that this is something that is in a high quality journal. And rarely, if something happened that related to that paper that was really important, and this is just one, I pulled this from my own CV. I think I've done this on 1 or 2 occasions. If it caught a lot of attention, like, hey, you were interviewed on CNN after this was published, or you got 1 million tweets about it, say that so that people understand this isn't just a regular paper. This is really, it's either caught the public eye or it's shifted the field and it's been highly cited. Lastly, you do need to provide the work type. This is a relatively recent addition to within the last 4 or 5 years. So if you have an older CV and you have papers on there that don't specify original work versus case report versus editorial, I can't remember the, and systematic review. You need to go through and add that. Caveats, please don't add works in progress if they're not yet published, but they are submitted. There is at the bottom a section of works in submission that you can specify, but if you really haven't even written the paper, don't put it in your papers. And also be careful with non-author consortiums. What I mean by that is, and this is becoming a thing now in hospital medicine, and it may in broader GIM. Usually this was like genetics and astrophysics. Like basically everybody who walked in the building at a particle collider got their name of like along with 5,000 other physicists around the world who thought of some experiment, right? And it's kind of crazy. So they said, we can't do this. We can't publish these papers with thousands of names. So they create a consortium and they say, go to this website and you're in this consortium. The problem with that is that it's not, when it's applied in our area, it's really, the UW doesn't consider that level of involvement to really be a paper that goes under bibliography. So Home Run, which is a consortium of hospitalist researchers that has started doing this, may have worked with you to do some chart reviews, for example, and then somebody else published the paper, and yeah, you're listed as an author in a consortium. Just be careful not to overstate your involvement here. And what you can do is create a separate section. So you claim credit on your CV, but you're straightforward that you didn't really write the paper.
Where would you put something like interviews? Like if you do an interview for someone, either like on the news or the radio or?
That's a great question. And you can create a separate section called media appearances. And I think it depends on what the context is. So if it's about a paper and it was sort of a one-off, then put it underneath that paper to say like, interviewed by Como News about this work. Alternatively, you can sort of put it in the section around like CME talks. I would just caution you to make sure that the prominence of those, because these aren't peer reviewed events, pick things that are pretty notable. If you got interviewed by the med student blog, don't put that on your CV. If you got interviewed by a national news organization, totally fine, yeah. It's a sign of having really done work that might shift public opinion. All right, so there's tip 6.5 on the preparing your CV for promotion, which is because we have fabulous Shom Mukherjee at the University of Washington, many textbooks have been published with many GIM co-authors, and some of them have been fortunate enough to go on to subsequent editions. And subsequent editions of the same chapter that you only like changed a few words on, they count as another entry. So in this fictional textbook edited by John Amory, the chapter that Shom and I wrote in 2015 is one, and then the second edition in 2021 is another, even though maybe we didn't actually update it very much. But sometimes I see people forget to take credit for both instances of a publication. All right. Who reviews your CV? Hopefully you know these people, right?
There's a question in the chat there, Andrew.
Oh yeah. Does each chapter become a separate entry? Yeah. I mean, that's basically what I'm saying is that not only each chapter, but each edition. So if you wrote, thank you. Yeah, good point. So if you wrote 4 chapters in one book, each is a separate entry. If there's a second edition of that book and all 4 of them are in the second edition, now you have 8 chapters to list on your CV. All right, so hopefully you have met with these people before or know how to get to them. They are the first step in the annual review process and advocate for you in the promotion and merit review process. Know your section head, know their role. One thing that can be helpful is to update your CV. This is just sort of my personal advice, like lots of other tasks, like, I don't know, updating your car tabs or something, like try to do this at least once a year, but even better once a quarter, or if you're really active, once a month, I don't know, but it's really hard to think back to things you did more than a year ago and try to reassemble your CV, and you'll actually forget stuff that's important. And so a little prevention is a lot better than a big chunk of cure or just forgetting something entirely. Spend some time fitting the UW format, because many of the section heads will, and Bill's got a great point here. I keep a shortcut on my desktop, and if something comes in, I cut and paste on the CV. That's actually exactly what I do, is I have a folder right on my desktop of CVs, and then before I forget, I go into the latest version of the CV and drop it in there. Don't spend your annual review fixing your CV, right? Fix it in advance and have a really meaningful conversation with your section head. And a lot of that can be driven by the augmented CV or the IDP. So I'm going to quickly mention how those combine with your CV. And this doesn't apply to folks at the VA entirely, but UW faculty code has the following advice about yearly activity reports, and your augmented CV is considered your yearly activity report. And these forms are, according to the rule book, these are evidence for recommendation of promotion, merit, salary, or tenure. And it sort of pains me to say that it was very common when I met with faculty, at least in hospital medicine, to see both CVs and augmented CVs that were well over a year old and didn't describe what that person had been doing. And I realize it's a pain to write these things. And some people don't, myself included, don't like writing about themselves. It feels like bragging when you want to be modest. The reality, though, is that when you show up to an annual review with something that's totally out of date, it just sort of makes that person wonder how you're spending your time and whether they're going to be able to help you, and if you didn't bring them the material that will help them to understand what you're doing with your time. So the augmented CV, just a reminder, it's 2 pages, totally flexible format and content. So this is another space you can share whatever you're working on that hasn't reached your CV. So there's plenty of opportunity to just tell the story of what you're doing. An IDP has much more structure. These are required for faculty in the regular faculty, so clinician, scholar, physician, scientist. They're optional, and I think they're a useful tool for introspection, but they really take kind of the form of a contract that is signed by you, your primary mentor, and your division head or section head about what you're going to be doing in the next few years. So they aren't for everybody, but just the process of going through one, which it's really distinct from a CV, right? It's about what you're going to do, not what you have done. But the two often go together, and they can be really helpful. So if this is something where you're in a full-time clinical path and you think, I'd still like to, go through that effort of developing an IDP, contact your section head or your sort of clinic or hospital group director and say, hey, how do I get a copy of this? Because I want to sit down and think it through. And so I'll say, you get out of these what you put into them. Again, if you're coming to your annual review with something that's 2 years old, it's kind of like Dilbert asking for advice but doing it really poorly and not being clear on why he didn't get promoted. All right. So I'm going to pivot to the other core topic here of using your CV to apply for a job. I just thought this was hilarious and so 90s, like these parents think this child who's amazing at Super Mario Brothers has got some career prospects. And funny thing is this actually is a high-paying career now, which wasn't when I was a kid. But anyway, the bottom line is, esports. Use your CV for success. And what that often means here, this is sort of a Venn diagram of sorts. is that there are things you need to do to make your CV work for promotions, and you have to follow UW format. There are things that are universal. You got to have proper grammar, style, spelling, a digestible length. But when you're applying for something, you may literally gut and rewrite your CV in a totally different way. And I want to give you some examples of that. Yeah, random question, do you all keep 2 CVs, like one regular CV format and one UW format? Maybe I'll try to answer that as I go through, like, what are the special forms of CVs that you might keep on the side away from your UW format. So one of them, which I realize may not apply to many or all of you, but I think is sort of an interesting twist on this, is what's called the NIH BioSketch. This is something you need to apply for just about any grant where you're going to get money. And it's common outside the NIH. So this isn't just for NIH, although they set the format of it. And it looks a lot like a CV, right? You put your education, you have a personal statement about what you're doing with your career, positions and appointments, this section called contributions to science, and then a link to your bibliography. So it has a lot of the things about a CV, but what you're really doing with this document in your personal statement, which is usually 2 or 3 paragraphs, in your contributions to science, is you're saying, okay, here's what's on my CV that is going to make this grant succeed if you fund it. And I pulled an example off. This is the NIH website example. This may be a fictional person, I don't know. But this is their contributions to science section. It gives you an example of what's in there. So this person says, I directly documented the effectiveness of various intervention models for older people with substance disorders, et cetera, et cetera. This body of work discusses the prevalence of alcohol and amphetamine use in older adults, right? So here's some probably real, I would guess, person who is saying, hey, I've done some important work in this area. Here are 3 publications that prove it. And in the personal statement, they would say, basically the grant that I'm applying for has something about substance use in elderly individuals. And this would be basically the proof that they're qualified to execute that project. And what's really different about a BioSketch from a CV, where you're just updating it, constantly adding stuff, is you deconstruct this and rebuild it each time you apply for a grant. So recently I applied for an informatics grant, and I focused entirely on things I had done, publications I had that related to EHR interventions. I applied for something related to patient safety, and it was really a different BioSketch. And this kind of principle of, when you're applying for something, know your audience and write to them, understand their needs and target them. That is the key to all these special forms of CVs. Does UW count scholarly SOME work? Sorry, is that School of Medicine, or tell me what's, I don't know the abbreviation, SOME.
I think it's social media.
Oh, social media. Yes and no. That's really a, yeah. I think that a lot of folks in department and division head roles struggle to know what to do with those. I think there's been growing recognition that holding a Twitter chat, for example, that attracts a lot of eyeballs is really important in terms of spreading ideas and shifting opinions. How to count them, people know how to count grants because they have dollars, and how to count papers. I don't think they've quite figured out how to count social media interventions. So I think it's totally fine to list them. I would have a more detailed conversation with your section head around, what do you think this means? And then how do you, I don't have a swift answer for you. And part of the reason I say that is, you're going to probably have to convince them first, that they will go on to convince the division head and the department chair and others that this work is really notable, and not just like you kicking around a few tweets in your free time. I think I'm probably not prepared to say a whole lot other than it might go on your CV, and I would hash that out with your section head. Sorry, that's a punt, but that's a good. I'll try to think about that if Shom ever has me back.
Andrew, can I ask you a question? And actually, I'll give my 2 cents on social media stuff as well. I think you need to have evidence of impact if you're going to consider putting it on your CV. If it's not peer reviewed, then at least think about how you're going to show that it had an impact. My question, Andrew, is should any of us think about why would we worry about a biosketch if we're not applying for a grant? Is that the only reason to think about it?
I'll tell you, that's the only reason. I didn't mean to take a lot of time with this topic. I will just share quickly my personal journey, which was that I was full-time clinical when I started. And I was doing some scholarship as a clinician scholar. And then one day my mentor said, hey, would you like to be on a grant? I was like, yes, that sounds amazing. He said, great, give me your biosketch tomorrow. I was like, what's a biosketch, right? So if you are in that kind of pathway of starting out clinical, angling towards scholarship, and then all of a sudden find yourself as a co-investigator and somebody's like, and this is often how it happens. They're like, this grant is due tomorrow, right? And we're adding you. It just helps. If somebody had told me, here's what a biosketch is, I would have been at least a step ahead. Of course, at that point in my life, I didn't have any contributions to science. So yeah, and Alicia says literally having to do one today, right? So it's totally not for everybody in the division, but I just wish somebody had told me what it was, and then I would have been a little better for that situation. Sorry, so not to belabor this, plenty of advice on NIH website, and the other place you can go is ITHS. There's a 45-minute recorded talk, Biosketch 101. Okay, and this is what I was saying. Even if you're not a scientist, you might need to prepare one as a co-investigator. All right, so another niche kind of CV is derived from this scenario. You're invited to give grand rounds. Awesome. And the chief resident calls you up. Hello, Dr. Young and Famous. Is the chief resident here? I'm so glad you're giving grand rounds. I'm preparing to introduce you. Do you have something I could use? No problem. Here is my 22 megabyte, 329 page CV. Have fun, right? Okay, well, this has happened to chief residents. I'm not saying that you will do this, but the problem that this person experiences is then a 10-minute introduction that cuts into their talk. It's got a whole bunch of irrelevant detail, and it does not present that person in a good light. And you don't have to have a 329-page CV to have this happen to you. So don't do this to the chief resident, and don't let it happen to you. Write it yourself, right? So put your own best foot forward. Even if all you're doing is even a local noon talk, fine to hand something to the chief resident if they don't know you already, right? I keep this in a folder online with a headshot because if I'm ever doing something out of the UW, they may ask for that. But like, what do people really want to know about you? It's not 5-10 minutes of talking about every accolade or educational event in your life. Where are you from? What expertise do you hold that makes you qualified to give this talk? What are you doing with your life right now? And maybe something that makes you seem like a human that other people would want to know. And that ought to cut it. And then you you set yourself up to launch into a talk that people are going to like and feel like they know you in a way that you want to feel known. All right, finally, the other kind of hyper-tailored CV is a job application. And I want to highlight that although accomplishments are essential, length can be burdensome in the setting of somebody who's looking to make hiring decisions. And you may want to create a CV for a job application that starts with the UW format and then cuts out huge sections that you know are not going to be of importance to that employer, so they can quickly assess whether you have the minimum qualifications that they're looking for. So on the one hand, get trapped in the UW format when you're using it for internal promotion. Don't get trapped by it when you're doing something that requires an application. And ways you can do that, depending on your circumstance, like I have sort of a physician scientist or a educator example here, you might say, you know what, I don't want to, I'm applying for an external job. I want them to know that I'm accomplished in this field, but it's not the main focus. I'm just going to delete my bibliography and say I've written 35 papers, 12 rows of first author. Or if you're an educator as your primary focus, I've been a mentor for over 100 residents as paired, I made up that number, but like 100 residents in my clinic over the last 15 years with an average evaluation of 5.8 out of 6, right? And then they don't have to sift through. What they know is, oh, this is somebody who's taught a lot of residents and really good at it. Like they don't have to read through every lecture you ever gave. Similarly, here's something you could say, if you're applying for a clinical role, I have this huge panel. I do this with very little FTE. Most of them need interpreters, right? I'm going to be skilled at X job that you're hiring for. So these are the kinds of things that don't appear on a UW CV, and you absolutely should reconstruct the CV to highlight the things that you want to broadcast. The cover letter is complementary to the CV. It requires your effort, is definitely not an afterthought. People who are looking at applicants will read these carefully. And this is my pet peeve, but I think this is widely held. Do not emphasize what you want. Emphasize what you're going to accomplish for the employer. It is really annoying to read a cover letter that says, I am looking to have a high-paying career where I develop as a physician and I receive lots of faculty development, and you send me to lots of conferences. And literally, it's from the heart. That person, they want to say, I'm looking to grow as a physician, but what they're communicating instead is gimme, gimme, gimme. And what you want to do is say, I understand your organization, I understand your purpose, your mission, I'm going to serve it and help advance it, and I'm great at it. And later when you get the job, you can negotiate for stuff, right? That's the time and place for that. Don't put it in your cover letter. This happens all the time with graduating residents, you wouldn't believe. And please don't do it. So I think I'm basically done. Miss Dilbert, it's out. Do monitor your social media presence, and don't panic. Your CV doesn't. I've tried to offer advice for optimizing, but it's mainly there to get you an interview. Once you're in the door, it's done a lot of its work, and you can represent yourself from there. Oh, finally, things that will basically not get you an interview if it's incredibly poorly written, so long that it's incomprehensible. If you are sending it to 30 or 800 employers all at once and you're not even editing it, or it's just full of irrelevant material. These are things that make it hard to get excited about interviewing somebody.